Welcome to 12 Hours in the Future with Maria Sanchir. Today, my guest is a playwright, actress, director of plays such as Breaking Night, Sweet Spot, Saint Wig, Young Bird, Little Victories, El Dia de los Muertos. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that, Under a Bronx Moon, and A Sparkler, who is also happened to be my professor for screenplay writing, Professor Stephanie Stowe. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to say that you are my first female guest, so I'm honored to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Maria. I am completely honored to be your first female guest. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited for this.
Me too.
Yeah, like I was telling you, it was the screenplay writing class is a class that I was dreaming about to take. So,
Oh, thank you
um,
so much.
yeah. So I want to begin asking with the question. I know that your first one is an actress. You have
Yes.
a, yeah. So I want to ask what led you to directing and writing? Like, what was the pivoting moment? Like, oh, this is something that I want to do, like, not acting, but this.
That's what a great question.
Thank you.
I came to writing kind of a little bit differently. I didn't when I was originally in college, just to take a step back, I was originally a fine artist. I was really interested in the fine arts, painting, sculpture, and then ended up sort of transferring colleges. I had a kind of nomadic childhood. I moved around a lot, and even in my college career, I switched colleges sort of midway through my undergraduate. So I ended up transferring to a college out in New Mexico called New Mexico State University.
Right.
Aggies, yeah, Aggies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I finished my degree. And at the time, I was going there for art. And then within the first year I was there, I decided I really wanted to maybe pursue some theater.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very well-known playwright at the time who was on the faculty there. His name was Mark Medoff.
Right.
He won a Tony Award for Children of a Lesser God.
Mm.
He was just a really, really interesting artist, writer, and very generous, and had stayed in New Mexico rather than go to LA, as most writers will do once they kind of hit it. I always thought it was really interesting that he stayed at this sort of small state college, well, large state college, but it was a agricultural college basically. And he was really the first playwright that I met. I didn't at the time even have any kind of, I couldn't imagine that I would be a writer eventually, or even want to be a writer. I was really sort of locked into being a performer in theater. But I was able to work as a student with him on a couple plays that he developed while he was there. After, of course, Children of a Lesser God. So that was kind of exciting for me as a young actor. And I watched his process, and I kind of just saw how he developed scripts, what he did while he was working with the other student actors. And even at that time, I wish I could say that a light bulb went off and I was, this is what I want to do, but that didn't really happen. It would not be for a couple years. I would graduate from college. I joined a national tour,
Mm-hmm.
an acting company called the National Players. They're based out of Catholic University, and they're the oldest touring company in the United States. So I did that
Wow.
right out of college. It was a lot of fun, very hard work because
Mm-hmm.
you're on the road,
Yeah.
driving, performing, doing everything you would do to put up a show. And then it really wasn't for a couple more years. I lived in Denver for a
Mm-hmm.
while after I left New Mexico State. And New Mexico, went to Denver, ended up finally in New York City, where I was pursuing my dream of being an actor. I was
Mm-hmm.
going on the auditions, and had an agent, was sort of booking things here and there. And it was really in my late 20s that I had been on several auditions, and for new things. And the stuff I was reading, this is going to sound really pretentious, but I was reading a lot of scripts, and I thought, I think I could do this. I think I could do this. That's pretty. I mean, I still to this day I don't really know why I thought I could, but I just thought, why not? So
Sure.
I had an idea for a play. I sat down and I started writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I just loved it. I loved it. So I really was sort of teaching myself. I mean, there was no YouTube videos or anything back then. And I mean, I'm sorry to say I didn't pick up a book to read about playwriting or anything. I just sat down with the knowledge that I had of having been an actor at that point for a couple years and been on all of these auditions and read bunches of plays. And that's kind of how I started. You interview my husband, Dante Alberti, on an earlier podcast.
Yeah.
And I one day handed him the script and said, I know I'm your wife, but take a look at this and tell me the truth.
Hmm.
And he's pretty honest. And he said, I think you really have something here. I really do. And that was kind of, I got excited about it. I started developing it more. And then within the next, I would say, year or so, he was running a theater at the time in the Bronx. And that's actually how we
The
met
Belmont.
years before, the
Yeah.
Belmont, right? And we said, why don't we see about getting this, producing it,
Hmm.
self-producing it. So we did that. And that's kind of where it took root. We had a really wonderful run. It ran for about 4 weeks. I got my first New York Times review, which
Wow.
was unbelievable. This
Wow.
little theater in the Bronx. It was a good review, but there was a couple lines in it, that kind
Hmm.
of, to this day, I kind of look back, but it was, listen, for a young, well, at the time I was, young playwright. They were kind, and nobody saw it though. Nobody saw the review. I thought I was going to become, a big
Right.
famous playwright after one play. It didn't happen, but it really did cement my love for the craft of writing. And, I'd love to say I quit my job and I began writing
Hmm.
full time. I didn't. I was working a full time job, and continued to write on the side and started to develop other plays. And that's kind of how it happened. That's kind of how it
Yeah.
happened.
So you
So
gradually fell in love with writing,
I fell in
basically.
love with it pretty quickly. And it's really interesting because I look back at that first play now, and I've learned a lot since then, obviously. Not, I mean, of course, including about the craft of
Right.
playwriting and what makes a good play work, and how hard it is to write a good play. But I've also learned a lot about life. And, it's really interesting because the topic of that first play was about two siblings, two
Hmm.
sisters who are living in New Mexico, and they are having to reconnect after the death of their mother
Right.
from cancer. And at the time, I was writing not from a place of real knowledge because I had not lost my mother.
Hmm.
But it's really interesting to look back at that play now, because I did just before COVID. My
Yeah.
mom sadly passed away, and I was with her.
Yeah. I'm so
I
sorry for
was
that.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
thanks so much. Yeah, I was lucky enough though to be out in New Mexico with her. She was out in New Mexico at the
Hmm.
time, just as the character of my first play was, and was able to sort of care for her those last 5 weeks of her life. So it's really interesting to look back at that play now and see, what I got right and also what I got wrong about
Right.
that
Hmm.
experience.
Hmm.
I think it's interesting to be able to look back at that and now apply my own life experience to what that character was going through, or what I imagined would be, the trajectory emotionally of someone dealing with that kind of loss.
Right.
Yeah.
My grandfather was the first professional filmmaker in my country, and
Wow.
he said to my mom when she was like 17, 18, she's just fresh out of school, and she's like, well, I want to be a filmmaker. And my grandpa was like, you simply don't know life enough to become a filmmaker, you know? So
Yeah.
that's why I sort of like waited for my turn as well, because like been through so much that I look at life differently, I guess. Uh, you know what I mean? Like when you're
Absolutely.
a child, I guess. When you're 17, you were a baby.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. When you're young, I mean, I have met really, really wonderfully talented young
Oh yeah,
writers
for sure.
who do have, all writing we pull from a resource of
Yeah.
imagination, but and I've met wonderful young writers who just instinctually are very in touch with things way beyond their life experience or years. But for myself personally, I also, just looking back at my own experiences, I know that I'm a much stronger writer now just because of
Mm-hmm.
the broader experience I have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's so interesting too, because as you become, if you're in the arts and you're developing work as you get older as an artist, sometimes you find that things are it's a little harder to sort of get your work seen because there is a little bit of ageism, I think, out in
Oh
the
yeah, for sure.
community, the
Hmm.
arts community,
Hmm.
young playwrights, emerging young playwrights. But I think there's a place for all artists, regardless of your background and talent. But I do think it's interesting, and reflecting back on my own experience, I can see the growth, and I wonder how much I'll know in the next 10 years, hopefully,
Right.
if I'm still around and writing,
But it's so
which
cool though.
I
I
hope
mean,
to
like
be.
it's a straight indication that you're growing, right? I mean, like otherwise, like if
I
you look
think,
like something that you've done like 20 years ago, like I was so
yeah.
good. Then like,
Yeah, I wouldn't trust that. I wouldn't be
yeah,
like, oh, that was my best work
yeah.
ever. Yeah. I like to think that hopefully my best work is ahead of me, and that
Mhm.
all the pieces I've written
Mhm.
and worked on with other people, collaborators, are sort of wonderful steps towards that, even better work that I hope I have waiting ahead for me. That's how I like
Right.
to think about it anyway.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean, I often tell my students that
Mhm.
too, that, every semester, um, I am good at what I do. And I think
Mhm.
I'm a good teacher,
Mhm.
helping my students understand the different crafts of playwriting and screenwriting. But I'm also learning. I'm always learning. And when I'm working with a fresh semester of
Mhm.
students, I myself am returning to my own work often and looking at it every semester differently
Right.
because of the students I'm meeting and the work that we're reading. It just sort of helps me look at the projects I'm working on with fresh eyes. I think that's really kind of one of those amazing things about being able to teach in higher education, especially be able to be teaching in courses,
Right.
creative courses, to be able to then go back and allow that to resonate in your
Mhm.
own work to some degree or to a large degree.
Yeah, it's so great. I love the class. I just look at the other writers that we're, in the group. We work in the groups with
Yeah.
each other, and just the things that they are writing. I look and I think like these are actually people who can actually really do this, like for
Yeah.
sure, for real, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when it's not good, you kind of you could tell, because we all read. Yeah,
Sure.
so yeah, so I'm like I love the other to read other screenplays, and they're like so good. So I wanted to take to Aaron Sorkin. He's probably one of, well, probably one, the most famous one there is around the world, right? Like the people don't really know the names of the screenplayers, but Aaron Sorkin people know. So I might be like a little bit butchering what he said. It's not a quote, but he said something like, "When you finish your first draft, you sort of know where your story is going, where you're discovering what your story is about." So I wanted to ask, how do you approach it? Like first draft versus second draft. What's your initial step? Let's say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting whenever I've had concepts for plays or stories, I almost always um, have a really, really clear idea of what that very first moment is and what the very last moment is. That's kind of always been the way I worked, and I'm not sure, or
Oh,
the way that
interesting.
I
Hmm.
approach storytelling. I think it could have a lot to do with the way I came up in the theater and understanding the power of the beginning and the power of an ending, of course, because those are things that you have a few minutes to sort of hook an audience. And at the end of any piece of writing, of course, you want to have people walking away changed, remembering those last moments
Hmm.
and remembering how those last moments made them feel differently, perhaps,
Hmm.
or, maybe they just sort of, made people feel a little more confident in a belief they already had, whatever,
Hmm.
whatever that feeling is, I think. So when I approach a story or a play, I'm always thinking about that. And to me, that's the easiest part. The hardest part, which it's often spoken about, is that middle, what happens in the middle to get you there. But That's where I usually start. I usually start with a very clear idea. In the play Yardbird,
Uh-huh.
which was the second play that I wrote that was produced, and I also got a very small New York Times review that nobody saw. That was my
It's
second one.
so, I
Uh,
mean, like, I'm so surprised because New York
yeah,
Times is the go-to, isn't it?
well,
I
it
mean,
is the go-to. I think
yeah.
for the first review I got was in a sort of the Westchester version of the New
Hmm.
York Times, and then the second review I got for Yardbird, which was produced in 2004 at the Bank Street Theater in New York City. It was an online. They only published it online. It
Hmm.
was, I think, New York Times was doing a lot of things where they were publishing reviews online, so it wasn't print. And at that time, still in 2004, print was still king. So it was a lovely review, though. It was glowing and very wonderful. But oh God, I lost where I was going with that. So I was talking about Yardbird,
Yeah.
Bank Street
The
Theater. Where's I
yeah, yeah,
going?
yeah.
Oh,
The
Maria.
the question was like the first draft versus the second
Oh,
draft. Yeah.
yes. So thank you for that.
Sure. No, no problem.
I was, it's funny. I had a very clear image, and my inspiration was really at the time I was working at a job, a corporate job, and it was pretty much, we called it, my husband and I would joke around that it was what we called the golden handcuffs job, which I think a lot of artists can find themselves caught in. It's a job
Yeah.
that is really stressful
Oh
and
yeah, for
exhausting,
sure.
but they pay you a lot of money. And there was a joke my husband would make at that time. Every time I would try to quit, they would just offer me a raise. So my husband would say, "You're quitting your way to the top." So long story short, I was on a train ride one day, as I often was, on very early in the morning, and I was just looking at these buildings, all the buildings in New York City, as you're just before you go underground,
Hmm.
in the subway system and train system. And I just was looking into all of the apartment windows and thinking to myself, sort of that cliched thought about there's so many people and there's so many lives and there's all of these people living very compact. And I just had sort of an image of a young man who was could not leave his apartment, was sort of trapped in this apartment and codependent on a mother. And I had a very clear
Mm.
ending moment of this young man wanting so desperately to join the world, but because of
Hmm.
his mental illness, being completely unable to. And I
Right.
wondered, where would it start and what would happen in between. And that just really, that seed of that final moment,
Hmm.
for me, dramatically became the play that is Yardbird. And that's kind of where I jumped off with that particular piece.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's kind of where I started.
It's
Yeah.
so interesting. Do you like the next step for you would be like, do you go and brush on like more on dialogue, or you like concentrate on the plot, or you do like all the same? I mean, all everything at the same time. Like, what would you do the
Yeah.
next?
I mean, when I first started originally writing, my process was really sort of character driven. I
Mm-hmm.
was really
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the characters a lot. I wasn't really thinking about structure as much. And
Right.
that's something that's changed a lot for me in the last, I'd say, 20 years. I'm much more, I think a lot more about structure, and formula. I mean, there are structures and formulas that exist in all writing, and I think once you get comfortable with them, you can sort of riff a little bit on them. But in the beginning, it was really character driven for me. I was thinking about what these characters were, not so much their goals, of
Mm-hmm.
course, but what they also were kind of yearning for. What did they
Right.
want? That's even deeper. I mean, goals are things that I think characters know they want, but a lot of times what they're actually yearning for is the deeper motivation that they may not even understand. Yeah, they themselves might not understand. But if you're doing your job as a writer, there'll be little hints of that for your audience, and they'll pick that up, and they'll know something about that character that maybe the character doesn't even know about themselves yet. And I think that's a really wonderful thing you see in some very good writing that hooks people in, because they want to see, will this
Mm-hmm.
character get what they're yearning for? Or do they even understand themselves? And yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Do the people pick up on the hints? Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Um.
audiences really like to, I mean, I say that a lot in my classes,
Mhm.
that audiences want to work. They want to play detective a little bit.
Mhm.
That's also, I think, a trick in good writing, or a tool that's used, is to let the audience feel like they're working a little bit to make the story to follow the points of the story and to piece together things. It's fun for a lot of audiences. If they can figure out what's going to happen immediately in the first 5 minutes, it's much harder to keep them engaged. It's
Yeah.
almost
Don't
impossible. So
underestimate your
yeah,
audience, right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Do you struggle with any of this ever? Like, I'm like separating in my mind like dialogue, plot, character arc. Would you like sometimes like run into like dread one of those, like I'm not like, I don't love this,
Yeah.
but
Oh
this one
yeah,
is
sure.
difficult. Like, do that.
Absolutely. I mean, when I've all the things I've read, I mean, and I've
Mm-hmm.
I've read, I think, a lot, but not as much as some, and more than most. But um, I'm always thinking, when I get hung up on something, I will step away from it for a period of time. I'm kind of a little bit of my process too is I could be working on two or three things at the same time, which I don't really know I would advise that as a rule. For me, it seems to work because if I'm stuck on a project or a particular scene, or
Mm-hmm.
not really instinctually knowing or feeling where I want to go with it yet, it helps sometimes to step away and focus on someone else. And by someone, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, another character, another arc in the scene. And a lot of times I'll find after I work on that, it's easier for me to return to the thing that was giving me a little bit of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for me, dialogue has always been a little easier for me. I struggle, I think, a little more with making sure my structure is as tight and as effective as it can
Mm-hmm.
be. I think a lot of writers can struggle with that too, but um, that's kind of where I get hung up sometimes, is really even with an outline and even with
Mm-hmm.
understanding where I'm going. Sometimes you get into it and it's a hard sell. You're not quite sure
Right.
it's gonna fly.
Mm-hmm. Uh, do you act out your scenes? Like,
That's so
to just
that's so
know
funny you asked me that.
the pace,
My
if
I
the pace is working, like running around, like
Oh, it's
really
so
into
funny.
it.
I'm actually working on a new play and I'm only maybe 20 pages into it. And I often make force my daughter. I have a teenage daughter, and I'll
She's
I'll
15,
ask her to
right?
read
I
it.
think.
Yeah, yeah. But I just a couple days ago I said, "Hey, would you read this with me? I just want to hear it. Can we just read it together just to see what the flow is,
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I don't necessarily act it out myself, but a lot of times I will, recently. That's a recent development because
Mm-hmm.
she's a little bit interested in drama and theater. I
Uh-huh.
mean, it wasn't
Acting. Uh-huh.
we were surprised for years she wasn't interested in it at all, especially since we both have backgrounds in it, but she's
Mm-hmm.
starting to kind of be a little more interested. So she'll do it, and then she gives me really good notes.
Oh,
She's
that's so
actually
cool.
really tough, which is
That's
good.
so cool. I'm just imagining Professor Alberti running around with you.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yeah.
That would be so funny. uh, so when you have a block, yeah, I'm sure you've experienced that as well. Like,
Yeah.
except for going to something else and coming back, like, because sometimes I have like, it's just not there, like
Yeah.
empty. And I can't do anything like for days and weeks. And do you have any kind of advice that usually works for you, like last resort?
Last resort. That's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't call it a last resort, but I over the last, I'd say, 2 years, I have some very good friends, very close friends, of writers, fellow writers, that
Mm-hmm.
we have set up a monthly meeting that we
Mm-hmm.
kind of gather either over, when it was COVID, we would do it by Zoom. And just last week, I met with them in the city for a couple hours, and we share each other's work. And
Mm-hmm.
just the process of setting a date. Our next meeting is June 2nd. So I know that I have to have pages prepared for them because they're going to have pages prepared for me. So it's this really great sort of kick in the pants goal that I know that I've got to write. I've got to produce something for them to read.
Uh-huh.
And right now I'm working on a novel that I've been working on for a couple years, and they've been really, really instrumental in helping me. I was stuck for a while,
Uh-huh.
and I would be working on all kinds of other projects, and just in the last couple weeks, just the idea, because I had that goal set and I knew that people would be, they're on me a little bit, like you
Mm-hmm.
bringing new pages in, what's next. That helped me kind of kick myself into gear. And also I try to, when I'm really, really stuck, I try to remind myself that, that sort of thing we've been talking about in class, to write with the understanding that you're going to edit, that this
Mm-hmm.
idea is
Mm-hmm.
not, it's not about, and I know that about myself. I think I'm a pretty ruthless editor on
Uh-huh.
my own work. Just, I think just in general. And so I understand that. I know that that draft that I'm going to give them is not going to be the final one. And so I
Not
think,
set in stone. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if I tell myself that mentally when I'm sitting down, especially when I'm stuck, it doesn't really matter what I write that day. It could be 10 pages of, I might hate all of it, but the process of doing it, the practice of it and the discipline of doing it will often help me just push through the block, even if it's just stuff I end up cutting or I hate.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
I just find that the exercise of it, or the practice of it, often it's kind of its own best medicine for being blocked. And I mean, there's all these sayings about writer's block. I think one I heard recently was, there's no such thing as writer's block. There's just, self-judgment. And the
Oh.
minute you remove that, the block goes away. I mean, I don't know if I really buy that, but I do find that if I, one, set a goal that's not just a personal goal, but that has, you know, people that I respect and, know are going to be, you know, keeping me honest.
Mm-hmm.
I find that I do meet those goals a little better because I know I have to get stuff
Right.
produced for them. And then it kind of, the minute I take myself out of it a little bit, um, it seems to flow. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a trick, but I would say for anybody who's writing and trying to write, and finding it difficult, that I think it really does help to sort of, if you can find a community, and it doesn't have to be a lot of people, just a couple people that you really trust and that will give you good feedback and be really thoughtful with your work. That can be a really great resource for writers.
Because
I
I
found it
think,
has been for me. Yeah.
yeah, the writer's block is the most famous question ever. I think like everybody's like, if you're asking a writer, you ask about the block.
You
Uh,
know,
yeah,
I don't, if you remember, we had a guest speaker, Ed Stone, my
yeah.
friend who's a screenwriter. And he
The
said something
pause of
terrific.
fury. Yeah,
Pause of Fury,
yeah.
yeah, opening in July. I thought he said a great thing that I had never heard, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, I found it really helpful. If you're in a scene and you're really, really writing, and you're cooking on it, and it's amazing, and it's just kind of flowing, to stop before you finish the scene. I thought that was so fascinating because you know where that scene's going, but the danger is that you finish that scene and then you're like, oh, that's great, that just kind of came to me and I got it on the page, and then the next morning when you go to hit that next page, it's blank and you're stuck. And his advice was to stop before the end of that scene. You know it's flowing, you know exactly where it's going, but stop, make a note of where you want it to go, and the next day come back and resume the scene, and that somehow often that will carry you into the next scene. I haven't tried it yet, but he said that that's something that he will rely on, and I thought it was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it made me think a lot of things. Like when he said that, I like, oh, do I do that? Like maybe unintentionally. Like, do I do that? Will it
Mhm.
work? Like, and I'm like, it's so interesting. Like, I never thought of it like that.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
interesting. Yeah. This concludes first part of my conversation with Professor Stephanie Stowe. The second part will follow.
12 Hours in the Future is produced by Jim Carney and Maria Sanchir, with technical help from Curtis Antwi. Special thanks to Professor Tom O'Hanlon, Dean James Mann, and Magda Soto. The executive producer and host of 12 Hours in the Future is Maria Sanchir. 12 Hours in the Future with Maria Sanchir is a series of conversations recorded by the Bronx Journal Radio through the resources of Lehman College, City University of New York. You can find us everywhere podcasts are available and on YouTube. This show is protected under international copyright and may not be recorded or retransmitted without written consent. Until next time, when we see you 12 hours in the future.